For 41 years, one of Britain's most important human fossils was a lie. The skull was human. The jaw was orangutan. The teeth had been filed. The bones had been stained. The fake survived not because every expert was foolish, but because it gave British science the ancestor it was already prepared to welcome. Old, brainy, English, and prestigious enough to make skepticism expensive. Piltdown was not only a forgery of bone, it was a forgery of institutional confidence. To see why it worked, start with the man who brought the pieces to the museum. Charles Dawson was a solicitor by profession and an antiquarian by enthusiasm. He had a reputation as a collector of local curiosities and had previously made finds that attracted the attention of that museum's scientists. In 1908, he claimed to have begun finding fragments of an unusual skull in a gravel pit at Piltdown. By 1912, Dawson had brought the finds to Arthur Smith Woodward, the museum's keeper of geology and one of the most respected figures in British paleontology. Together, they excavated the site further and found the jawbone. The announcement at the Geological Society of London in December 1912 was met with substantial excitement. The specimen appeared to confirm a theory that had significant institutional momentum, that human evolution had proceeded by enlarging the brain first, with other features following. A large brain case combined with a primitive jaw fit this model precisely. It fit almost too precisely. But in 1912, that precision read as confirmation, not suspicion. Piltdown was not a marginal curiosity accepted by a fringe. It was endorsed by prominent figures at the museum, published in respected journals, and reproduced as casts that circulated widely. The skepticism began almost immediately, and it never entirely disappeared. It was simply never sufficient to displace the consensus. Within a year of the announcement, several anatomists published reservations. They argued that the skull and jaw were more likely from two separate creatures than from one. The combination of features was too extreme, too convenient, too nearly a perfect intermediate form. Those objections were noted. They did not prevail. Part of the reason was the site itself. Additional finds at Piltdown, and later at a second site, which Dawson also reported, seemed to reinforce the specimen's authenticity. A forged specimen does not come with follow-up corroboration. Piltdown did. Part of the reason was the alternative. If Piltdown was fraudulent, then a very prominent find at a very prominent institution had been a spectacular mistake. The cost of the alternative was high, institutionally, professionally, nationally. And part of the reason was that the specimen said something the field wanted to hear. To understand how this happened, you have to look at 5 conditions that were present from the moment the find was announced. The first, the discovery aligned with national and disciplinary expectations. By 1912, significant early human fossil finds had been made in continental Europe and beyond. Neanderthal remains in Germany, Homo erectus in Java. Britain had produced nothing comparable. There was a recognized deficit, and it carried an edge of national embarrassment in a scientific culture where prestige and imperial identity were entangled. Piltdown was found in England. It was found by an Englishman. It was, if genuine, among the oldest and most significant human ancestors yet identified, potentially older than the continental finds. It arrived at a moment when British science was specifically disposed to receive it. The alignment between the specimen and the expectation was not invisible, but it was read as significance rather than suspicion. The fact that the find was exactly what was needed was taken as evidence that it was real. The second, institutional prestige made skepticism socially expensive. The museum's endorsement placed Piltdown inside the most credentialed possible frame. Arthur Smith Woodward was not a credulous enthusiast. He was one of the most respected paleontologists in Britain, and his judgment carried institutional weight. To challenge Piltdown after Woodward's endorsement was to challenge Woodward. To challenge Woodward was to challenge the museum. In a field where careers were built on institutional relationships and reputation, the social cost of sustained public skepticism was real. Prestige does not produce fraud, but prestige can insulate fraud from the scrutiny that would expose it. The third, early inconsistencies were visible but easy to discount. The anatomical objections raised in 1913 and 1914 were substantive. The combination of a modern-seeming brain case with an ape-like jaw was, as critics argued, more consistent with two separate creatures than with one transitional form. These objections did not require advanced forensic techniques to raise. They required careful anatomical examination, which several researchers performed and published. But the publication of an objection is not the same as the establishment of a consensus. The objections competed against the institutional weight of the endorsements, against the follow-up finds, and against the fit between the specimen and the prevailing theoretical model. Each inconsistency, individually, could be explained or set aside. The pattern of inconsistencies was never assembled into a sufficient challenge. The fourth, the theory-friendly story, outran the quality of the evidence. The physical evidence for Piltdown consisted of bone fragments recovered from a gravel pit by a single collector over a period of years. The provenance was not independently controlled. No other trained observer had witnessed Dawson's earliest finds in situ. The site had been disturbed by gravel extraction before systematic excavation began. These were significant evidentiary weaknesses. They were present from the beginning and were discussed in the literature. But the specimen had been accepted by major institutions, incorporated into the evolutionary narrative, and repeated through authoritative channels. By the time a generation of students had been taught Piltdown as fact, the evidentiary weaknesses were buried under layers of citation and institutional affirmation. The story the specimen told had been repeated so many times, in so many authoritative contexts, that its original evidentiary basis had become almost invisible. The fifth, better methods later revealed how weak the case always was. Fluorine analysis, a technique for estimating the relative age of bones based on fluorine accumulation, was applied to the Piltdown specimens in 1949. The results indicated that the skull and jaw were far more recent than the original dating had claimed. In 1953, a team conducted systematic analysis using microscopy, X-ray examination, and chemical testing. The results were unambiguous. The teeth had been mechanically filed. The jaw was from an orangutan. The bones had been stained to mimic ancient coloring. The case had never been strong. The methods that revealed the fraud had not required a technological leap. What had been missing was not the capability to investigate. It was the institutional will to demand investigation. The identity of the Piltdown forger has never been definitively established. Charles Dawson is the primary suspect. He was the only person present at every key stage of the discovery. He had a documented history of presenting finds that were later questioned. He died in 1916, before the fraud was exposed, and left no confession. Analysis using modern genomic and spectroscopic techniques has pointed strongly toward Dawson as the sole forger. For the purposes of this episode, the identity of the forger is less significant than the question of how the fraud persisted. One person, with relatively simple materials and a basic understanding of what the field was looking for, produced a fabrication that occupied a central place in British science for 4 decades. The forger did not need the evidence to be strong. They needed it to be just sufficient, just plausible enough to be accepted by a system that was already disposed to accept it. The Piltdown hoax is easy to read, at a distance, as a story about gullibility. 41 years seems like a long time to be fooled by a filed orangutan jaw. But the word gullibility misframes what actually happened. The scientists who accepted Piltdown were not credulous. They were operating inside a system of institutional validation that had worked reliably across many previous cases. They were applying the standards of their field. They were evaluating evidence in the context of a theoretical framework that the specimen fit. What they were not doing, what the system did not require them to do, was ask whether the specimen's perfect fit with the prevailing theory should itself be a source of suspicion. This is the hardest version of the lesson. It is not that institutions fail when they apply their standards carelessly. It is that institutions can fail precisely by applying their standards correctly, when those standards were not designed to detect a specific kind of problem, and when accepting the answer in front of them feels like the rigorous choice. The Piltdown specimen arrived with the right credentials, at the right moment, telling the right story. The system evaluated it through the available lenses and found it acceptable. The lenses were not designed to ask, what if this is exactly what someone who understood our expectations would construct? 41 years is not evidence of stupidity. It is evidence of how much work institutional belief can do, and how long it can do that work without being asked to justify itself. The Piltdown skull sat in museum collections for decades. Casts circulated to universities. Textbooks and lectures reproduced the reconstruction. Students were taught the name Eoanthropus dawsoni and the place it occupied in human evolution. None of it was real. All of it was authoritative. When the exposure came in 1953, it came not through a sudden breakthrough, but through the systematic application of methods that had been available for years, applied by people who had finally been given institutional permission to look. The specimen had not changed. The will to examine it had. That is the mechanism that runs through this story from beginning to end. Not one forger with a stained bone. Not one credulous examiner who should have looked harder. A system that was organized around confirming what it expected to find, and that therefore could not easily see what it had not expected to find hidden inside it. The institutions did not ignore the evidence. They processed it through every available channel. The channel was not designed to ask whether the evidence was too good to be true. It was, and it took 41 years to find out. The failure was real. The cause chain was longer. You already know the headline. The record shows the mechanism.
Specificity and rank define the order, but fragile architecture can't hold water. It's a cascade of forgotten code. A heavy legacy begins to overload. A cascade